you will face this issue, because in inheritance this is a common rule you have to follow. So how you can extend the code and reuse the code? By using inheritance and aggregation. You know two techniques. Aggregation is object to object communication, we call it as has a relation, and inheritance is a relation. So generally what you need to remember about inheritance, one point is this one. Okay, next, you already aware of polymorphism also. In while working with classes, you already know about polymorphism. So in JavaScript, you learned the concept of polymorphism. What is the concept of polymorphism? A single superclass reference can use the memory of multiple derived classes. Multiple derived classes. That is the polymorphism. Can use the memory of multiple derived classes. So you already know the concept of polymorphism. So here, because you already learnt all these in JavaScript, we need to just remind you about the topics. What are those? Class members, and inheritance rules, polymorphism, all these things, how they work. So now you are aware of all the classes concept. Now we can use this in designing component. We will see how to create them. So what we are going to do is we are going to learn about React class components. React class components. So before coming to this point, you should be aware of class rules and class related basics. So that you already know in JavaScript. So now, after just having a overview on what we already learned in JavaScript, now how to implement the class components. So now the question is, always the question is, which one is best? Whether to create a component with a class, or whether to create a component with function. These all you will come across now, you will see that, right? Let's see, already functions we learned. Now how function components work, what's their behavior we saw. Now we will see how this class will work. So first point is means how to create a class component. How do we create a class component? Actually, React class component is designed by using JavaScript class. By using JavaScript class. React class component is designed by using JavaScript class. So that means what we have to do, export class and class name. So this is component name. But the question is, how React knows that it is a component? It's an ordinary JavaScript class. If you use the word class and you give a name, then it is a JavaScript class. How a compiler knows that it is a component? So, to give the component behavior, in order to give the component behavior, every component class gets the behavior from the base classes, from the base class. So from the base classes, we have two important classes. One is React.component. Another one is React.pureComponent. We have two important classes. These are two important classes. So you created a class, but it doesn't behave like a component. To give a component behavior, we have a base class called component. Every component class should inherit this React component or React pure component. So see here, let's go to our project. In this first, we will create one component. We are going into the components. I will give a separate folder, class components. Okay. Now let's add a folder. All your rest of process is same. So your rest of process is same. I will create a folder. Suppose register user, and we will add a JSX file, register user.jsx. Now this should be a component, and we want to create a component using class. Then we will use export class register user. The rules of naming are same. You have to make sure that the name of class starts with an uppercase letter, because component rule is the components must start with an uppercase letter. Next, important, this is not having component behavior now. It's an ordinary JavaScript class. How it gets behavior of component? It should extends. It should extends. You know, extension is inheritance. It inherits React dot component. This is the base class. It should extend. Now it is known as component. Now register user is considered as a component. It gets all the component behavior. There is another class. We can use React component, or we can use React.pure component. So this is a common question in interviews for old version people, because these days we don't prefer this at all. But still in interviews these questions are common. Why? Because already they are working with class components in old projects very much. In new projects we don't prefer classes at all. That means in new version of React, official community avoids. Official React community says don't use them until or unless you badly need them. So technically this is a question in regular interviews. What is a pure component? what is a impure component, what is controlled component, what is uncontrolled component. These are common React interview questions. What is difference between pure and impure component is nothing but actually pure component and impure component is a component generally loads everything, means it reloads the component whenever any change occurred in the component. So some change occurred in the component, then it will load the entire component. Pure component means it loads only the changes. It will not load entire component. That means which one is good in performance is pure components are good in performance. Why? They are asynchronous, more asynchronous. That means in a component, suppose you have a component in that there are so many forms and you made a change in this form, then it will load entire component. Then it is unnecessarily loading others also. If there is a change in this form, then it can load only this one. It no need to load entire component. Only the changes need to be loaded. But this is not a great practice because anyhow we handle this by using Ajax. That's the reason we don't prefer this much. We have pure components, but you will not see people much using that because they because when you make a Ajax call, you use any third party like Axios and all. By default, they are Ajax. They are already asynchronous. You don't need them. And there are techniques called routing, which will load without refreshing the complete content. So this doesn't makes much difference in future, and if they are dealing with other techniques of Ajax. If a component is not using other techniques of Ajax, then they try to create a component using what? Pure. Otherwise, you will never see much people designing a pure component because already their component have asynchronous approaches with various techniques. Then they don't want any component to be asynchronous again. That's not required. So you have two important points. What is difference is component base will load entire component whenever change occurred. Pure component base loads only the changes in component, only the changes in component. So component base, how the components work. So we have pure and impure components. So you can create a component using class, but it is considered as component when it is extending component or pure component. So syntactically now we have to first import React from React. Then we have export class, some register extents, react dot component. That is the second point you need to know. So the rules of naming component will be same, but every class component must extend either React component or React pure component, any one, either React component or pure component. So that is the component. Next, as per the rules of component, what we discussed, here it is using extend, means it is inheriting. Then you have to follow inheritance rules. Otherwise it will fail. What is the inheritance rule is, just now we discussed inheritance rule. You will have a constructor, and this is actually derived constructor. This derived constructor must have a super constructor call. That is mandatory. Because this is a super class which have a constructor which you have to call in the derived constructor. Otherwise in JavaScript inheritance fails. You already know the inheritance concept, right? Already we just now discussed. As per the inheritance rule, a derived class constructor must call superclass constructor. That is the basic rule. So this is another point. Okay, next what is another rule about component? You learned rules about component now first. What is another rule about component? A component must render markup. Mandatory na? A component should render markup. We discussed rules about component. A component must render markup. It should render a markup presentation, a fragment. Component should render a fragment. We discussed that fragment can be defined in three ways. Any HTML container or empty fragment or React dot fragment. So as per the rules of component, so it should return a fragment. And how it returns a fragment? It is a class. Can a class use return keyword? No. Then how it returns a fragment? Function is returning a fragment by using just return. How if class can return? Class related any functionality is managed by methods. Class have properties and methods. Functionality is managed by methods. And this derived class, this base class provides a method called render. This render method is responsible for, so it is going to provide a method called render. This render method is going to return the markup. It returns the markup. This render method is going to return the fragment. So either it is a pure component or an impure component. They have a method called render. Through this render method, you can return any markup. So let's see. We use a component, and here we are using render method. Render is a method configured in the component base. So we have to use this render method. You know how a method is written. and this method have to return. What it should return? It should return some markup. That means it should return some markup. How it returns? That means actually this return, now it is just like a function you have. This return have to return a markup. That means we defined some markup. You know, a method can have a function. Directly function cannot be a class member. That means now it can return the markup. And you know empty fragment, how they are defined. You can use React fragment or any container. So here I just keep a heading. So register class component. Just heading I am defining here. Now save. Now let's keep it in the startup. We will go to index and how to use it. This is register user. It's a class component. Anything, the process is same. I am just refreshing, and register user is a class component and it should work. So what is the basic point here? Another rule is class component. Class component returns a fragment. Class components returns a fragment using render method. Using render method. So class components returns a fragment using render method, and it must call the super constructor. It must call the super constructor. It must call the super constructor. That is the rule. Syntactically now, export class some register extends react.component, and in that constructor, this constructor should call super constructor. Then we have a render method. This render method have to return. So return the fragment. The fragment it have to return. This is how we configure a class. So class component extends React component. So when it is extending the component, it should implement. It should call the super constructor, and it must return markup by using render method. So what it is going to do, it is going to render JSX elements in virtual DOM. That's what it is going to do. Okay, now this is the first point. I will copy this example. I'll just keep it as an example. This is register user.jsx. Your components will have same JSX, but this time we are creating by using class. Okay, now The basic presentation is okay, ready. So in this, what is the key point is data binding, class and the style binding are same as you defined in function component. Everything is same. Data binding, class binding, style binding are same. There is no change in this. Are same as you defined in function components. That means the binding expression and all. But here, where do you store the data? Here you cannot use variables because variable cannot be a member of class. Then usually where you store the data in property. Again, property is not mutable across requests. In general, properties are mutable, but in a component, properties are immutable. Then again, component needs a state. By using state, you need to configure. That means how do you store the data? Where do you store the data? You need a state, and you cannot use state hook. Hooks are not allowed in class because class will not allow functions, and every hook is a function, so no chance. Then how you manage state? How do we maintain the state? So here data cannot be stored in variables. Data cannot be stored in variables as they are not allowed in class as class member. Data can be in property, but it is immutable in a component. But it is immutable in a component. So you cannot use use state hook in class component. You cannot use state hook in class component. So hooks are functions and they are not allowed in class. Hooks are functions and they are not allowed in class. They are not allowed in class. Then how do you handle the state? Where do you store the data? How you configure the state and use the state? And this is the key point here. You can temporarily keep in properties. Just like in function we kept in variable. In the beginning of data binding, we learned storing data in a variable and binding to UI just for practicing sake. Like that, you can store data in a property and you can bind. But that is not the point. Suppose you see here, how do we store? I create here a property called, suppose property as title is a property. In that I am storing something. So welcome to React class components. And I want to display that here. I want to display that here. Now we have a property. You need to access that here. You know how to access properties binding expression. How do you access the properties? In a class, you have to access the class members. Then you have to use this keyword. This dot, what is the property title? Then it is going to access that and show. You can store data in a property and you can use it. Suppose you have cities is an array, and you have all, so you have Delhi like this, you have Hyderabad, and you want this in a drop down. So you want this in a drop down, then you put a binding expression, this dot cities dot map. You have to read every city, and for every city you have to put an option. This option will have a key called city, and it should print the city. We are reading every city and printing that, and you see it's same. So this is how we define using property. This is example property, data in property. How you keep the data in property and how do you access? You know, you have to access by using this keyword. But how do you maintain a state here? There is no use state. So what is the specialty here is actually React component base provides a state. React component base provides a state. It provides a state. It is going to provide a state. Now, what is the advantage of that is you can use the state for storing the data. That means React component base will provide the state. So how do you access it? How do you use it? What is the rule about state we learned? What is the rule about state we learned? About state also some rules we learned. You remembered we discussed why to use the word const. Why not var and let? Remember? Why? Why to use const? Why not var and let for state? So as per the rule, state must be initialized. Must be initialized. Compulsory. And it must be initialized. It cannot be assigned. It cannot be assigned. So at the time of creating a component, the state is initialized. And once it is initialized, you cannot assign another state. You can use it across any number of requests. So the base class provides a state, and as per the rules, state must be initialized at the time of creating component. Now where the creating of component is happening and who is responsible for creating the component? In a class, who is responsible for creating a component? Constructor. Na? What is the role of constructor? Instantiation means what? Creating an object. So at the time of creating an object for component, that means component is being created. At that time, state must be initialized. So as per the rules, state must be initialized at the time of creating the component. So where should I declare the state now? I have to declare the state in constructor. Why should I declare state in constructor? Because as per the rules, it must be initialized at the time of creating component, and the constructor is defining activities to perform at the time of creating a component. That's what we discussed about constructor last session. So constructor is responsible for doing that. So here we will remove this. Now inside the constructor, we need to configure the state. Who provides the state? The base class provides the state. So automatically the derived class is having state. Base class is providing the state. So automatically it is having state. You can access that by using this dot state. By using this dot state. And state is an object type. It is an object type in class. That means it is an object. You know, object have keys and values. So one key is a title. In that, welcome to React classes something, comma. Another one is categories. Categories is an array, and here we have like all. We have like electronics. So we have like footwear. This is how we design state. You cannot use state hooks here. State is implicit. That's the reason what earlier people used to say, we don't have state for functions and we have state for classes. But that doesn't make any sense anymore, because so those are all, because people these days, when they want to attend any interview, they browse React interview questions answers on Google, and they see so many questions and answers, get prepared on them. And what do you think interviewer will ask from the questions that are shown on internet to you? That means he is such a fool that he don't know that you will Google. Everybody sillily just Google React interview questions before going to interview. What do you think about interview? You don't know Google. He done more Google than you, right? That means he can, according to your answer, he can even tell from which website you learned this answer. Because see, interviews are not get prepared through websites, questions, answers. Why? Because the majority of interviews depends on what the skill sets you are showing while asking the question. He will change. The questions will be automatically changed. First, he will ask a basic level question. You are unable to deal with it. Then he thinks that it waste of time to ask complicated things to you. Then he will just go basic level. Once you are good, that means, remember, if your interview is becoming very complicated, means he is asking too in-depth questions, that means you are doing good. That means you are answering well, because he don't even prefer to go in depth if you don't answer basic things. He thinks it's time waste to ask all these in-depth questions to him. So he will just go with the basic level, because you are unable to handle basic level itself. So that's the reason these all points are very basic. On internet, you will find so many differences which are no longer valid for current generation versions. They are not at all valid. But for the satisfaction of the interviewer, we need to remember these because they are still working with them. Their companies projects may be still on the older versions, then they have to follow this, they have to know this. So we should be aware of that, but it is not a key thing now. Why? Because if anyone says function cannot have a state, that's wrong. We already learned how to maintain a state, because these hooks were not there in the previous versions of React. Then the first difference they used to tell us about class and function is class can handle state and function cannot handle state. But recently they changed the definition little bit, like class is stateful and function is stateless. Why they given this point? Because stateful, because it is implicitly having state. Stateless, because implicitly functions don't have state, they have to explicitly use state. But they can never say that it doesn't handle state, because it can handle state using external functions. So state is implicitly configured. So you can configure the state and it should be like this, right? So what is the rule now? So the custom components can access the state, so which is an object type, state is initialized. State is initialized in constructor of custom component. Here custom component means the component we are creating. State is initialized in constructor of custom component. So using this dot state, syntactically you have like class means just constructor. I will give you in the constructor we have this dot state is equal to, it is an object, you know, key and value. You have key and value references. That's how you define. So that is configuring the state. Now you know that here state have two members now. What are those members? A getter and a setter, right? One is to read the value configured in state, another one is to store the value. Now how we set the state here? This is initializing. You can read the values with reference of this. How you can read the values? Let's see here. I want to print the heading, and here how do we access this? We are using this dot state dot, we have a title. It is going to access the title and show. And how you access another one? We have an ordered list. So this dot state dot categories dot map, we have every category and a list item, and here we put the category. So we have a key. All other basic things are same, huh? Now you can see this is how we do. how we can access the state and use the state. So you can access state. You can access the state using this dot state. So we have to use this dot state dot key. That's how we need to define. So little change in the way how you deal with the state. There generally you use a destructuring technique. Right. That is key point. So we have to manage the state in this way. Okay, we are accessing it. Then how do you assign a new value into a state? You know that assignment of value into state is not possible. Assignment is not possible, right? Because once a state is initialized, it is constant. You cannot again assign anything. Then what you have to do, you have to initialize. Again reinitialize, na? We have a setter. We discussed that question, very important, asked in interviews, like why it is constant but it allows you to store a new value, because usually constant don't allow to store a new value. But you are not assigning into state, you are again initializing into state. A new value can be initialized into state by using set state method. So React component, React dot component base provides set state method, so which is used to initialize the state, which is used to initialize a new value into state, which is used to initialize a new value into state. We have to use this dot set state, and you have to define like this dot set state and an object with a key and a value. You can initialize new values into it, because you know state is a object type. State is an object type. You have to set state, and into that you need to define an object with key and the new value you want, whatever the new value you want to initialize into that key. Already the key is initialized with specific value. You want to initialize a new value, then you have to define in this way. Right. Okay, now another concept is that means, okay, set state is there, then when to set the state? You need to set the state on specific event, right? On button click, on change, or somewhere. How about loading the component? How about loading the component? Here we have a separate discussion on component life cycle. Class components have a life cycle. From the time you create the component to they destroy, there is a life cycle. We will see that. So here you cannot use effect. You cannot use effect, because use effect is a hook. Then how you define actions to perform at the time of mounting the component. What is the purpose of use effect? I told you use effect is used to define the actions to perform at the time of loading component. Technically, we call it as mounting. We don't call as loading, right? Mounting the component. At the time of mounting component, you want certain actions to perform, then you use effect. That's not possible here because use effect is a hook and you can't use them in here. Then how you define actions on mount? So for that, what we have to do is React component provides component did mount and component will mount methods. Component did mount and will mount methods, which are used to define actions to perform at the time of mounting component. At the time of mounting component. So you have two methods. Component did mount, component will mount. Before the mounting starts, if you want, then you can use will mount. After the mounting finished you want, then you can use did mount. Again, this cycle you are going to learn in next level. In next level, we will learn the complete list of component cycle, how it works, what are methods, what is the order of methods. I think if you already learned jQuery Ajax and all, you know jQuery Ajax have a life cycle methods now, like Ajax start, Ajax end, Ajax success, Ajax complete. That means actions to perform on start, on end, on complete, on success, on error. Similarly, here also we have a cycle. We will see that. But if you want any actions to perform, you need to define on mount. So what we have to do now here, we have to write a method. Already render is a method. Then how you define the method? Here we have to use component did mount. Component did mount. That is the method. On this method, we have to set the state. So this dot set state is a method. Set state, and you have to access an object. In this we have a title. That means set state is expecting title. That means what is the title you want to set. So set state uses set title, and what will be the title? Some hello React. That's on mount phase. It's not done, just roughly I'm giving that here. That means it will say hello React. We have so many events also to perform mount, unmount, and I told you when you learn cycle, we will learn. We have to put a new value into that. That means here we use another one. What is it? Categories. Categories we have like all, we have like electronics, we have like footwear. So footwear, we have like fashion. That means we are reinitializing those all values into that. Already they are initialized. We are reinitializing. That means usually, suppose what we say here, we kept it as an empty string, and here we kept it as an empty array. We are just initializing what values they should contain at the time of loading. You want some actions, some values to define that you can configure like this. You can do in this way. So set state is used to set a state, and usually we various events. If you want to perform on mount, then you have to define like this. Component did mount. So syntactically like this. We have component did mount, and here this dot set state is equal to key and a value. That's how we define. So how do we access the state? How do we assign and configure? So now I'll just give an example here. So register user.jsexsum. Let me copy this. Just an example to understand the basic state. How do we define the state? So if you want the state to manage multiple values, then every value is configured with a key and a value. Previously what we were doing, constant, use state means so many state we are configuring. We can just create one object and through that we can access the state. Now here, so we know now how to create a component, and we know how to store data and how do we access the data. Now data binding, style binding, class binding, everything will be same. That means what about class binding? Already you know, nothing special. Class name, what we have, container, then you can see it changes. We have like margin top 2, then it will change. So BG dark, these are all concepts are same. Text white, all are same, there is no change in that, right? And only the point is this time the data comes from where? It comes from a state, but this is like an object. Suppose you want to create one style object, what we do? We have a style object. Style object is equal, it is an object, and you know that what it should contain. Suppose box shadow, suppose we are giving like key, that is what box shadow, and it have like 2 pixel, 2 pixel, 2 pixel, some gray, like this we are defining. And how do you bind this? So how do you bind this? In order to bind this, we have to just put a what? Style. It is expecting this dot state dot, what is it? We have a style object. We need to configure that. These are all the basic things we have to define and options here, right? So we are going to learn everything. Don't get excited. So many things are there. Who is this? Tushar, right? Yeah. And keep patience, man. We just started learning and you are more than over forwarded than me, right? Keep in control. You will understand why you are excited about that. Because just now I said we are going to learn all this. He's already one step forward. How about events? That's what we are going to learn. So here, so don't get overexcited. So many topics are there. Right? So we are going to learn. I will not leave you without that. So Just we are discussing first basic thing, how to create a component, how do we set up the styles and use them, right? All other concepts are similar. There is no change. How you define and how do we configure and all. So this is about style binding, class binding, and data binding. In data binding, how about the concept of two-way binding? Two-way binding means we need to identify the changes and we need to update the changes. How do we identify the changes and update the changes? Usually, how do we identify the changes and update the changes? To identify the changes and update the changes, two-way binding in class. How you manage that? Two-way binding means you need events. Two-way data binding means you need all the concept of events. Let's create one and see how we can manage the events. Up to this, I will copy one. Suppose 12 pixel, 12 pixel, 12 pixel gray. So we are applying some box shadow. Style binding, class binding, all are same. Let me copy this one here. Yeah. This is example of style and class binding. Right. So two-way binding in class component. So what are the basic things you need to handle two-way binding? We need to identify the change on change. So events are same as function component. So means events will not change. Events will be derived from where? Events will be derived from which base? Events are derived from synthetic event space. Synthetic events, na? Synthetic events are what? Virtual DOM events, right? Virtual DOM events, right? And all synthetic events will map to the actual DOM events. We already learned synthetic events, all are same. So how do we deal with the events? How we can work with the events now? Generally, what is event? We know event is I given definition. Sender, subscriber. Sender sends a message to the subscriber. Generally, subscriber is a function, and in a class you cannot have function. Then usually subscriber is a in class events. In class events, subscriber is home. Is it any special thing? Subscriber is home. Functionality is defined with method, na? Yeah. Right. Functionality is defined home. In a class, who defines the functionality? Data is in property. Functionality is in method. So what is special in this? Subscriber is method. Right? That means now what event do? Event sends a message to the subscriber. Subscriber. You know already definition we discussed. All events are same. You have learned as function. Only the point there you point to a function. Here you will point to a method. And so many more points are there here. Of course, how you will access a method inside class? This keyword. You have to use this keyword. So how do you write here now? Suppose we need a button, and this button is like so submit or OK, and class btn and btn btn prime are dark like this. And we have a button here. This is a button. So btn light I will give. Okay. This is a button. On this button, we need a functionality. Then usually how you write a functionality? Just now, can you write a function here? No, it is a class, na? So class, where class defines the functionality? In a method. How you write a method? Same, it's like handle, okay, click. This is a method. What it should do? Some alert. So okay, clicked like this. Clicked. That's how we are configuring. How you will access this? On click. So we have to handle on click. On click, how you access this dot what? Handle okay click, right? That's how we access a function in a class, right? So that's how we define. And on okay, it shows an alert. But here so many more points are there. So configuring a function is not possible. So you define a method. So syntactically, we have a class, some name. In that we have a, so this is like method name. This method is going to handle all the functionalities. Then usually how button access? On click. Inside only, I'm just giving syntax. This dot what? Method. It should access the method and use the method. Just syntax I'm giving. Right. So that is basically how it works. Now, here some more rules are there. While working with events, some more rules and issues will come. We'll see that. But however, let's put the change event here now. Suppose two-way binding means change. Let's keep one option here. What we need means just basic. In the set state, we in the state, this is mount phasor. Remove everything. In this, we have a username. That's a string type. Now, what we will do here means in the state, there is a property called username. So here we are using a data list, data term, so username. So we will access input type is equal to text. Now whatever name entered we have to collect. Then what we will do? So we will write one method handle name change. We will collect E here. Now this is key point. Here you will face some issues that I will tell you. Event argument. That means how do we access this now? On change. On change is what? This dot handle name change. Now what this E have to do is, suppose if it is keeping console log E dot target dot what value. So you see now there is no problem. Let's go to the inspect in the console. Okay, so you see now I am typing here, it is okay, fine, it is working. But when you try to set this in a state, it will fail. It is working fine. But when you set this in a state, how do you set in a state? This dot set state is an object. It have a key called what? username in that e dot target dot value. That's how we set the state. When you are defining this, now comes the problem. You see now, I click inside and start typing, an error will come. This is the key point. I'm writing DOM methods, it's not giving any error. Alert name, no problem. Console log name, no problem. You use any DOM methods, no problem. But in state you are trying to set, it is unable to do. Why it is unable to do? Because actually this state is configured at the time of construction and the event is defined after construction. After construction, event is defined. At the time of construction, the state is defined. So events are not binded to state. Events are not binded to state. Event is not connected with the current class related state. If event is not binded to state, then how event can use state? Currently event is trying to use state. Use state means what? It is accessing the state and using it. But it cannot use the state because the state is created before it was created. And there is no connection between state and the event. Now class have to bind the event with state. Then event can use the state. Without that it will fail. That means now what we have to do is, there are so many techniques for this. One technique I will tell you. One technique is here. In this method, I am using dot bind. I am using bind. Okay, when I use that bind here, I am typing something here. Where to display it? You can display anywhere. Suppose here we will put a paragraph and we will say hello. How to display username? This dot state dot what? Username. And we are trying to access that here, and you see still it is error. Why it is error? Because this is bind is a method, but it should be defined in different ways at the time of construction itself. That means in the constructor we have to call this dot handle name change is equal to this dot handle name change dot bind. Now handle change can be used by your state and it should work. But here why it is not working? Because set state cannot read properties of undefined. Undefined, why it is undefined? So it is undefined because it is saying that this username is not defined, but it is defined. That means now what additional you have to learn is how a class can attach. There are so many techniques I will show you. How a class can attach its state to the events so that events can be used. Remember, if you are not using state, this is not at all a problem. Suppose I am not using state, I am using what? Console.log e.what target.value, or I am using here any method like what? Alert. There is no problem. Observe carefully now. I am typing here. I am typing here some A. It is working fine. The problem will come. It is not related to event. It is related to state not able to use the event. Then you have to learn some binding techniques. This is the key point here. So a note I will show here, the point is you need various binding techniques. in order to in order to bind the event with state, in order to bind the event with the state. Events events cannot use the state directly. Events cannot use the state directly. You have to bind. They cannot use the state directly. For that you need to bind with which class event, which class state event should use, current class state event should use. So usually what they do is, here there are so many techniques, I will tell you. First, this dot what, handle name change. This dot handle name change dot what, bind with this. That's what generally we configure. Bind with this means what? This means with current class. That means usually what happens. So it is now I'm using alert. We will put it in which location? This dot what? Set state, and in that what? User name. Username is e dot what? Target dot value. That's how we are configuring. But this is also not completed. There are so many other techniques. Now it will work, because now what you are doing, you are making this event to bind with the current class, then it can use the current class state, otherwise it can't. What is this mechanism behind this, how it works, we need to detailedly understand, otherwise it fails. This is the major change you will find in while working with events, and it is not required if your events are not using state. This is required only when your events are using state. Then we need to manage this. This detail we will see in next session. Right, in tomorrow's session, we will discuss about why we need binding, what is this binding, what are the various binding mechanisms used so that you can use events. If you know this, complete examples, whatever you tried in function, you can replicate in class. Right, that we will see in next session. Right, tomorrow we'll continue. Okay, right.
जारी करा